And more data from the National Bureau of Statistics. See, Nigeria residential energy demand side data shows, which includes charcoal, firewood, LPG, electricity from the national grid, all of that demand. The data shows fuel wood contribute about 40.7% of households purchased fuel woods, and charcoal, that's about 64.7% of households. They cut the wood used in charcoal production. Then for LPG, about 19.4% of households used LPG. That was in the last 30 days. Then for the grid supply, about 58.2% of households are connected to the electricity national grid supply. Well, join us to discuss prospects for Nigeria's energy transition process. We have Mr. Demola Ogumbajo, the President, CEO, Oando Clean Energy Limited, joining me right here in the studio. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Larry.
So looking at that data, you know, we've all been talking about energy transition, a just transition, you know, for Africa. And we have, you know, organizations like IRENA saying that we have to ramp up investment when it comes to renewables. So looking at, you know, Nigeria, you know, presently, how would you describe our transition process? Have we made some level of progress so far, in your opinion?
Absolutely, we have. As a matter of fact, we happen to be the first African country to release a comprehensive plan, which is the Energy Transition Plan that was released about 3 years ago. And what we have done with that plan is to show the world that we're serious about energy transition, we're committed to it, but we know how we're going to transition. We're curating our own transition ourselves. Yes, there's a global agenda. That's, you know, there's been attempts here and there to try to stamp a template of transition on the African continent. But by releasing that plan, Nigeria showed leadership, not only in commitment, but also in thinking through the process of the transition. Yes, a lot of people will say, you know, the energy transition is a little too heavy on gas. But then again, that's what we need as a transition fuel to provide the base load that's required to pull the trigger on industrialization, manufacturing, digital economy, and, you know, the industrial age that we're just now experiencing, all right? That said, however, we're clear as to what we want to do with transportation. That plan commits to electrifying public transportation in Nigeria by 2060, all of it, all right? That plan also has as an objective, I think it's the number 2 objective actually, the localization of the manufacturing of solar panels, because we have a huge agenda on the solar side that's been largely driven today by the REA, doing a great job there. And they also deploy other technologies beyond solar, but we all know that the 2 most advanced renewable energy sources today happen to be solar and wind. That said, however, we're also looking at the localization of EVs, both EV and solar modules, by 2025. And a whole lot of work is ongoing in that regard. The Energy Transition Office is leading the charge there. The NCCC is contributing significantly on the policy side to ensure that there's clarity as to how we're going to transition. Now, when you speak to just transition basically, in my opinion, means that we must not transition Africa into poverty. Therefore, we have got to retain the value that the energy transition process will generate on the African continent. And the best way to do that is to build local capacity, not only for technical expertise, but for industrial as well. So the localization of EV assembly in Nigeria is one of such. The localization of solar module assembly is one of such. And then producing hydrogen, biofuels, biogas, and other elements that, you know, feed into the energy transition to provide the kind of energy that we require, so that we see that number, the stats that you read out, about over 40% of Nigerians still burning wood.
Right.
So that we can see that kind of stats go down. And I say that, you know, to point to the fact that it's a double whammy in that regard. When we burn wood for cooking, we release carbon emissions into the environment. It hurts the environment, but it hurts us in return. But what it also means that what that does is, to get the wood, we cut down trees, which means we're deforesting, which then means that nature's capacity to absorb the carbon that is being released is also being impaired. So that affects our health at the end of the day. You then see a whole lot of the impact of climate change and deforestation. We already see, but a lot of us can't, connect the dots. Right? So you see a number of people, communities being displaced, not because of conflict, but because of climate change. Because their vegetation has receded, so they keep migrating down south. Some of the issues you find between the herdsmen and farmers, right, is due to foraging, okay? Leaving the north, coming down south for foraging, okay? And that's a function of climate change.
And quite a lot you've unpacked, there, definitely. But at the end of the day, we're seeing Nigerians have to pay a lot when it comes to energy. Shout out to the Band A, customers, all those, having to, drive their cars with fuel over 1,000 naira, per liter. So looking at what's playing out right now, how much of a risk is a cost of living crisis? We're seeing what's happening with the currency, right now, even though solar panels were cheap in the global market, but coming in here, it's expensive. So how much of these economic headwinds is putting a span in the wheel of this transition process?
We can't ignore the impact of the foreign exchange volatility. What it's done to our purchasing power, primarily, because we're net consumers, right? What I mean by that is we import most of the things that we consume. And in a situation where that is the case, it means the dollar becomes a commodity in itself. So Naira chases the dollar. It's basic demand and supply principles, right? You have limited supply of dollars, and then you have, somewhat...
outsized demand.
So we go after the limited dollars that's available because we want to import what we consume. That puts us on the back foot. And that points to the first point that I made earlier. We have got to build local capacity. We have got to consume locally. So even when it comes to energy transition, the sun is here. We don't have to import it.
Right, thank God for that.
What we need to import today is the technology to convert the sun into energy. But what we need to import is not necessarily the panels that convert the sun to energy, but the technology, which is the know-how. Which means what the private sector and the public sector must do is work closely together to build that manufacturing capacity and capability locally. Because if we do assembly, it's a start. But assembly means I still import components, paying dollars for the components, and then putting the components together here. It cuts out some cost, reduces, the price somewhat, but it doesn't take away the larger challenge of the fact that we're still net importers. So whatever it is that we do for this energy transition, we must not repeat what we have done with the oil and gas sector, where we would, drill for crude, export the crude, and then import gasoline. We've seen the effect of that. We continue to see the effect of that. Now that we must not repeat with the transition program. We must build local capacity to take away all these issues. Even when it comes to, commodity items, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whatever it is. If you do not produce locally, you will continue to import.
But in that whole, process of, getting to produce, sometimes you just need to supplement with a couple of imports. But we've heard, I've heard complaints about duties, at the ports, still, driving up the price, when it gets to the end consumer. So what kind of conversations are being had and, slashing some of these duties for some of these sensitive materials we need for renewable energy?
Oh, no, so the federal government is doing a whole lot of work in that regard. A lot of us do not know this, but whether it's solar panels, whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's charging infrastructure, or even some of the complements of CNG rollout. All of those items are currently VAT free, and you also have the opportunity to apply to the federal government to get a waiver on duty to encourage importation for now. But what must happen is, as we build local capacity through manufacturing, then we must go back to tariff for imported goods. Or else we'll have a challenge with allowing that local capacity to thrive. Everybody recognizes the fact that China has a higher level of efficiency when it comes to manufacturing, not only in comparison to Africa, but the entire world. All right? So if we continue to import from China, particularly if we do so without duties being paid or VAT being paid, because those elements fall under the energy transition program, then it means that we will not build the local capacity that is required to then drive, the kind of scale that we need to see. Recognizing that most of the funds that we are going to spend on these projects anyways, we're going to borrow. So look across the African continent. You will see different PV infrastructure projects designed for different regions across the continent. And if you put a number to it, Africa will spend north of $50 billion by 2030 on PV infrastructure alone. And if current trends continue, 90 to 95% of all of that money will find its way to China in exchange for solar modules and other components. So we have got to retain that value on the continent, and the best way to do it is to build local capacity for the supply of the things that we require. And that's the only direction to go.
All right, and definitely we've heard from most organizations in the renewables sector saying you need to ramp up investment, in renewables right now, but they've also talked about not leaving Africa behind when it comes to these investments, because Africa just accounts for about 1% or so, most of those investments. But, putting aside the issue of corruption, financial mismanagement, do you think Africa can somehow make this funding on its own?
We can fund our own way. I'll limit it to an individual so that we can understand this and connect with it. If a group of people, group of friends, have an agenda to see the world, travel the world, and some of them are, they have the money, they're ready today to go, and some don't have the money, they're not ready today to go. You can lean on your richer friends and say, let's create one pot. I'll put my little, you put your much, and then we see the world together at the same time. But if your richer friends are not that responsive, then you can say, you know what? We'll create a different schedule. You guys go now. I'll save up for my own trip. And I will go on the trip when I can afford it. That's what I mean by Africa can actually pay our own way. We just need to ensure that we curate our own timelines, we design our own transition mix, and we invest gradually. However, it means that my richer friends have no right to then put pressure on me on the timeline. So the world can do net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050, however you can afford. But maybe I will do net zero by the turn of the century, because that's what I can afford. If you want me to achieve it, by the way, by 2050, then perhaps you bring investment. So yes, we can pay our own way. We just need to ensure that we have a plan. It's a coordinated plan. The AU needs to sit at the center of this, that's the African Union, play the same role that the EU is playing, and then we follow through. We set our own standards, we curate our own energy mix, and then we do our own schedules. We know our timelines. However, again, I reiterate, if we are to do it on the same timeline as the rest of the world, then the rest of the world, who have polluted the environment much more than Africa can ever do, must be ready to then fund the Africa journey.
Fantastic. Well said. Let our rich friends carry most of that burden. But thank you so much. It was great having your perspective, Mr. Ademola Ogunbanjo, President, CEO, Oando Clean Energy Limited.
Thank you, Ladi.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure being here.
And we're hoping for a cleaner world, definitely.
Look forward to it.
All right, so we'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll get a check on what's playing out in the commodities market. That's in a moment. Just stay with us.